All right, well, there we are. We're a little bit behind. Moving forward. When's our next break? 11:45. We're about halfway through this section. All right, so here's where I wanted to get to. This is addressing some faulty notions in special education. So we're done our first chapter of today. Now we're moving into more special education, less about the ABA explicitly, because this is really important fundamental information that sets the context in which IEPs occur and education occurs in the school system. So for teachers in particular, this is going to be an exercise in critical self-reflection and looking at the systems we work in and maybe some of the things that we've been taught and the assumptions that we have, and maybe questioning some of those things. And I want to point out that I would consider a special educator to be a scientist practitioner, somebody who is familiar with the research and the science of teaching, right? That's the scientist part, and the practitioner is in the trenches, on the ground teaching, right? So your practice is informed by research. And that raises this issue of philosophic doubt. And philosophic doubt is a characteristic of science. And what philosophic doubt basically means is, as a scientist practitioner, I do what I do today, and I believe what I believe today because the research suggests that this is the best available information and the way to behave and operate today. But research is ongoing. And when new research evolves or emerges that makes me question something that I've done or tell me that I've been doing something less effectively than the new way, I will change my perspective, right? I will change my, if you want to say, philosophy, and I will adapt my practice to reflect the current research. Scientific fields advance this way. Medicine, dentistry, engineering, etc. are not philosophically guided. They are guided by the research. Practice has to keep up with the research. If the research changes and you don't change your practice, then you are no longer a scientist practitioner. It becomes dogmatic practice, right? And if you think about, this is built into the language of some professions, like speech-language pathologist. It's not a speech-language consultant. The pathology part means that it is analytic, right? That is the scientist practitioner element of speech-language pathology. In my title of board-certified behavior analyst, analyst means I'm a scientist practitioner. And if I don't change, right? Everyone else is moving along with the new research that says here's the better way to do things, but I'm stuck in my ways. I'm no longer analytic. I'm no longer a pathologist. I am dogmatic, and dogmatism is bad for students. So that's part of the context as we move through 10 faulty notions about teaching and learning that hinder the effectiveness of special education. It's a very widely cited study published in 2003 by Dr. Bill Heward at The Ohio State University. And there are 4 assumptions that we need to deal with before we move into the 10 faulty notions of special education that is intricately tied to the IEP process. Number 1, and I'll unpack these in a moment. Number 1, students with disabilities have the right to an effective education. 2, special education instruction should be individualized, intensive, and goal-directed. 3, research has produced a useful and reliable knowledge base for special education. And 4, research-based instructional tools are underused in special education. So let me unpack those. So number 1, the students with disabilities have the right to an effective education. The special educator's primary responsibilities are to design, implement, and evaluate instruction that helps students with disabilities acquire, generalize, maintain knowledge and skills to improve the quality of their lives in school, home, community, and workplace settings. I think that's very consistent with everything I've been talking about. Special education is effective only to the extent that students with disabilities acquire and subsequently use knowledge and skills that they did not have prior to that instruction. So there's this common question that's used in special education circles. And the question is, what's special about special education, right? It's only special if it brings about the desired behavior change, the acquisition of skill, and the generalization and the application of those skills. So that's the first assumption we have to deal with. Students have a right to this. Second, special education instruction should be individualized, intensive, and goal-directed. I could spend the rest of the day talking about this one, but I won't. Goals and objectives are based on assessment results with input from teachers and parents. That is actually baked into the IEP process that we'll talk about tomorrow. Teaching methods and materials are selected or adapted for each student, and specialist services, whether it's BCBA, speech pathology, etc., are accessed, as well as technology if necessary. So that second bullet there, teaching methods and materials are selected and adapted for each student. Now you're getting to the special and special education, right? That is individualized education, not picking from a checklist. And then clear, purposeful, precise, and structured instruction with repeated practice. And this includes methods not employed in regular education. And I said before the break that the National Autism Center, one of the conclusions from their research is that regular education is not an evidence-based tactic, right? So this can't be methods that are in the regular education setting. These are extra special methods. Let me drive this home one more time. Clear, purposeful, precise, and structured instruction with repeated practice. So that structured instruction goes to that learn unit, carefully delivered antecedents, getting the right learner response to occur, the learning, and then closing that learning loop with consequences. And repeated practice goes back to one of the big ideas I mentioned before the break, which is what is the greatest predictor of learning, period? It's the number of learning opportunities or response trials, the number of times you can engage in the behavior in response to the antecedents and contact some degree of reinforcement, right? So repeated practice is huge. I'll take the moment to talk about this now. Teachers all know that you are burdened with a huge curriculum that you need to get through in a limited amount of time. And the burden on teachers is we're doing, today's lesson, and then tomorrow we have to move on to the next lesson because we've got to stick to the schedule. But if a teacher recognizes that half my students didn't get today's lesson, too bad, we're moving on tomorrow. That leads to failure. Some students fall behind. What's missing there is repeated practice. And this is not a criticism of teachers. This is a problem with the system that requires you to move ahead on pace without necessarily delivering repeated practice. And again, learning opportunities, the number of learning opportunities is the greatest predictor. So I know lots of students where that first exposure, they didn't learn it there. And now we've moved on. We can't move on. We need to repeat it. I was visiting the school rurally recently, and my recommendation to the staff was, for this student, whenever you have them come and do any work with you, work meaning like worksheets and structured table activities, I'd like you to print out, right from the get-go, 3 copies of everything. Because what's going to happen is you're going to sit down with that first copy and you're going to help the student through it. And that help is called prompting. And the student hasn't learned it, they've learned to complete it with prompts. You haven't learned it until you can do it without prompts, without the help, without that scaffolding. So once you've done it the first time, then either the same day or the next day, repeat the exact same lesson and reduce your help, fade back that scaffolding and those prompts. And then by the time you get to the 3rd iteration, they should be able to do it independently. And if they can't, then they haven't learned it, and your repeated practice of 3 repetitions has been insufficient. So this is a pretty common tactic that I recommend in a lot of school consulting that I do. If you're going to teach something, you need to provide sufficient repeated practice until your student acquires it before you move on. And that's really difficult to do in the pace of regular instruction, because teachers are put in the position where they need to move forward on a timeline, right? And I know when I talk about this with teachers, I can't see you, but you're nodding along. That's exactly right? We need more repetition. All right, continuing on, number 2, both contrived and incidental naturalistic instruction for acquisition and use of targeted skills and knowledge. This means you can achieve individualized, intensive, and goal-directed instruction in the inclusive setting, or sometimes you're not able to achieve it there and you need to go to a room, to a desk somewhere else in the classroom, or maybe in the hall, or maybe an entirely different setting. I'm starting to move around a bit. I'm gonna make sure my cage has got me. You might have to go to another setting. Extremes are problematic, right? If you only pull a child out and you teach them one-on-one, that's segregation. If you only have them in the inclusive classroom but they're not learning, that might be a type of inclusion, but it's arguably not inclusive education if they're not learning. We need to have our students learning. And so this is really a point about you need to be adaptable, that some of the learning can occur ideally in the classroom. That is the ideal, because it is easier to acquire and generalize in the natural environment than to take from an analog artificial setting and bring back to the natural environment. But some of our students still need more individualized instruction that may not occur in the natural flow of the regular classroom, right? So it has to be individualized. I told you the story at the beginning of the morning of the young man who had 2 EAs, walkie-talkie runners. He was a runner, and he eventually graduated from high school and goes to university and works. When he was in kindergarten, he spent about 95% of the time outside of the kindergarten classroom because he wasn't able to be successful in the kindergarten classroom. And people might look at that and go, that's problematic. He was being segregated. On the other hand, he was being effectively instructed. And so by the time he got into grade 1 and grade 2 and by grade 3, that ratio of time out of the classroom had completely shifted. So he spent 95% of the time in the classroom. And arguably in hindsight, the investment of out of classroom instruction allowed him to be in the classroom, as opposed to feeling we had to stay in the classroom. And so this is very much a moving target in a gray area. You can't say, there's no formula that says what's right for everybody. You have to figure this out on an individualized basis. The goal is the greatest possible personal self-sufficiency, competency, and success in both the short and long term. We've established that. And the value, effectiveness, or goodness of instruction, right, whether it is in the classroom or outside the classroom, the goodness of it is determined by the student learning, not by the setting it takes place in, right? That's more of a philosophical interpretation as opposed to the ultimate measure being, did the student learn? Frequent direct measurement is needed to monitor progress and inform instruction. And we will talk a lot about that tomorrow as section 4 of the IEP in terms of the data. Assumptions 3 and 4 before we get to the 10 faulty notions. Research on effective special educational instruction is certainly not flawless, nor is it complete. However, there is a significant and robust and reliable knowledge base for teaching literacy and numeracy and a wide range of things to students with autism and developmental disabilities. We have the knowledge. The problem isn't necessarily the knowledge, and that, you can actually generalize that to regular education as well. The problem is the research to practice gap, where university programs don't necessarily translate the research to the teachers who are being trained, right? So we have the information, it's not getting to teachers. That's a research to practice gap. That is not the fault of teachers. That is a systems issue that needs to be addressed. I always enjoy teaching master's level students because I always get some students who come into my master's classes because they want to be a BCBA, and another portion of them, about half of them, they are teachers. And I always ask teachers, how did you wind up in this class? And they'll say, well, teaching is my passion. I've always wanted to be a teacher. And then I realized when I got into the classroom, something was missing. And then when I learned about this science, I realized that's the missing ingredient. This is what I need. This is what's enabling my students to be successful. And I love their kind of testimonials for how they discovered that. They've essentially discovered there was this research to practice gap, right, that otherwise isn't necessarily well known. So the goal for special education training should be teaching special educators to know that research, then to be able to select from that research and then apply that research with fidelity, right, with expert professional implementation. So those are our underlying assumptions.